Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to, I think, our last formal lecture of the year that I can think of as I stand here at least. Welcome to the Center for the Study of the Middle East. I'm Faisal Istarabadi, the founding director. Please put your cell phones on silent if you have them with you, and also you will see there are some sign-in sheets running around. Please make sure you sign that. We have to report names now and email addresses because of our federal grant. That will not automatically put you on our mailing list. If you don't wish to be, you can indicate that you do not wish to receive our emails. If you're already receiving our emails, you can indicate that, and if you're not but wish to receive them, you can indicate that as well. But we really need for everybody to sign in. We used to be able to just report numbers. We can no longer do that. As I said, it has to do with our federal grant. So please sign in. It is a genuine pleasure for me to introduce Djene Bajalan, who is somebody I've gotten to know over the years. He used to teach at the American University of Iraq at Suleimania, and we met during my sort of annual pilgrimages to the university there. It is a very interesting and exciting place and doing things that are unique, at least in Iraq. But in any event, Djene is now a little closer to home. He's an assistant professor at the Department of History in Missouri State University. He holds a DPhil in Oriental Studies. That term is still au courant, I gather, at Oxford. Yeah. He holds a DPhil in Oriental Studies from the University of Oxford. He has taught he's both studied and taught in Turkey, Great Britain, and Iraqi Kurdistan. Research focuses primarily on ethno-national activism among the Kurds of the Ottoman Empire during the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm not going to try the Turkish, a language I do not know, but he is the author of Young Kurds, the Kurdish Movement Before the First World War, published by Istanbul, Avesta Press in Istanbul in 2010. And he's published in and on a variety of topics relating to Ottoman-Kurdish relations in peer-reviewed journals such as Middle Eastern Studies, the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies, and Iranian Studies, and these are some of the most prestigious journals in the field. His work has also been featured on a number of media platforms, including Kurdish Globe, Open Democracy, Jadaliya, and Jacobin. He's currently in the process of finishing a monograph which examines Kurdish participation in Ottoman affairs in the lead-up to the First World War, and I know that he is under contract with Oxford University Press for that monograph. It's a genuine pleasure for me to ask you to welcome my good friend, Professor Djene Bajalan. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Istarabadi, for those very kind words, and of course for making this trip possible for me to undertake, so I can come here and speak to you all. It's very kind of you to extend the invitation to me to come visit you all here in Indiana. And I also want to extend my thanks to Ms. Webeck, who really did a great job in arranging everything for my trip. It was, she was extremely helpful. She dealt with all my issues, for example, my desire to have a hotel which is dog-friendly for my dogs. They didn't end up coming, so it's fine, but we're in the dog hotel, which was great. And I got to see a lot of dogs last night. So I really appreciate everything everyone has done today to make me feel so welcome here. So when I was invited to speak here, I thought I wanted to talk about my research, but also wanted to connect it with issues that are, relevant today. So I came up with the title, in a little bit of a rush, The Kurdish Question Beyond Statehood, from Ottomanism to Democratic Confederalism. And when I actually got down to the task of writing this, I was like, I think I've bitten off more than I can chew. This is a huge topic to deal with. So hopefully I will not bore you all to tears today with too many details and things like that. And I'm going to do my best to try and condense what is a very complex and detailed topic and make it accessible in a way that everybody can understand, even if you don't have a strong background in Kurdish studies or the study of the Kurdish people. And so let me outline how I'm going to approach the question today. So I'm going to start off by looking a little bit about, asking the question of what is the Kurdish question? How can we understand the Kurdish question? Then I want to talk a little bit about some of, and I know this is very boring for people sometimes, but a little bit about my theoretical understanding of nationalism and how that shapes my scholarship, before going into sort of details of how the Kurdish movement has developed over the 20th century, and how we can sort of look at certain forms of Kurdish politics as, in a way, non-nationalist. And I'll get to this topic in a bit. And the way I'll approach is I'm going to work backwards historically. So I will start off by talking about some contemporary events, and then try and link that back to political developments amongst the Kurdish community in the late Ottoman period. So let me begin with the first part. So what is the Kurdish question? And this is both a very easy question for some people, but when we get into the details, and the devil is always in the detail, it's quite a difficult concept really to come to a consensus on. So the Middle East Kurdish question historically has been interpreted in a number of different ways. So on one hand, we have Kurdish nationalists and their sympathizers. And you'll hear the refrain from Kurdish nationalists and their sympathizers that the Kurds are the largest nation without a state, or they're the largest stateless people. And this statement, although containing an element of truth to it, is also deeply misleading. Firstly, most Kurds in the Middle East possess citizenship of the countries within which they reside, whether that's Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Syria. There are, of course, exceptions. For example, in 1962, the Syrian government stripped over 120,000 Kurds of their citizenship on the grounds that they weren't really Syrians and they had no right to be in the country. We see a similar thing happening to Shia Kurds who lived in Baghdad in the 1970s. This group were deemed not real Iraqis and deported from the countries. But in general, for much of the 20th century, Kurds have possessed citizenship of the countries in which they reside. But as I mentioned, there is an element of truth to this, because when Kurdish nationalists and their sympathizers refer to the Kurds' statelessness, what they're really saying is that the Kurds do not have a nation state of their own. And so the idea is that, Kurds as a nation deserve to have their own independent nation state. Now, if we look at the flip side to this, we can see that state elites, as well as broad sections of the public in Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, view the Kurdish question in a very different way. They view it primarily as a question of security and, more specifically, Kurdish political activism, and in certain cases, even relatively benign expressions of Kurdish ethnic or cultural distinctiveness are regarded with suspicion. There is a fear that the Kurdish identity threatens the territorial integrity of the nation states within which they reside. This is particularly true in Turkey, which is home to the largest Kurdish population in the Middle East. And I could quote statistics at you, but frankly, any of these statistics counting the numbers of Kurds in the Middle East are pure guesswork, because the way censuses are taken in the Middle East do not usually record who's Kurdish, who's Turkish, and so on and so forth. So, you'll hear numbers like 15 million, 20 million, 10 million. It's really guesswork. But there's no doubt that the largest community of Kurds live in Turkey. And Turkey has historically been the most explicitly anti-Kurdish state in the Middle East. There have, of course, at certain periods in Turkish history been times of liberalization when there's been relative openness towards the Kurds. For example, when I was conducting my research for my PhD in the, I don't know what you call them now, the noughties, right? In the late noughties, there was a certain degree of movement on the Kurdish question. There was a relatively open atmosphere. Kurdish history and political issues were being discussed openly, but today a lot of that has been reversed. And in general, this fits into a pattern in Turkish history where we see deep hostility not only from the Turkish state, not only from state elites, but from large elements of the Turkish public who see the Kurds as a threat to the Kurds as an existential threat to the unity of Turkey. And this kind of fear that exists in Turkey is really well expressed in a common nationalist slogan, this combination of a fear of division and the idea that the Kurdish question is a security question. It's summed up in this saying, "Şehitler ölmez, vatan bölünmez," which can be translated, "The martyrs don't die and the fatherland cannot be divided." And so, and what this refers to is, of course, this slogan became popular during the conflict between the Kurdistan Workers' Party and Turkish security forces in the 80s and 90s, and is a kind of indication of how large sections of the Turkish population view the Kurdish question as a kind of threat to Turkey's national unity. So obviously, in these two readings, we have quite different interpretations of the Kurdish question. For Kurdish nationalists, it's a national question, and ultimately, the problem derives from the fact that the Kurds lack this nation state of their own, and of course from the state elite perception or the broader public perception in countries like Turkey and Iran. The Kurdish question is seen primarily as a security question. But what is quite interesting about these different conceptions of the Kurdish question is that both Kurdish nationalists and their opponents have a similar premise upon which they understand Kurdish politics. What is that premise? Well, it's basically the idea that Kurdish political activism, what we might call in America Kurdish identity politics, inevitably tends towards nationalism. And what I mean by nationalism in this context is a type of politics which drives towards the creation of an independent nation state. And where I derive my definition from of nationalism from is the work of Ernest Gellner, a very well-known theoretician of nationalism, who describes nationalism primarily as a political principle that holds that the political and national unit should be co-urgent. So I want to make a little addendum here. I understand in popular parlance and in academic literature, nationalism has numerous different meanings. It's used in different ways. So I want to be clear, the way that I'm using it is the way in which Gellner uses this particular term, i.e. as this political principle that holds that the political and national units should be co-urgent. So obviously from the nationalist perspective, the best solution to the national question is the creation of a nation state. This is definitely what large numbers of Kurdish nationalists believe. But it's also something that Turkish or Persian nationalists also agree with, because they regard Kurdish political activism as tending towards this construction of a nation state. So that's kind of like some of the background I want to give on how we might understand the Kurdish question and some of the interesting similarities between the discourse of both Kurdish nationalists and their opponents. So now let me move on to the issue of nationalism itself. So obviously, as we all know, today we live in a global political order which is very much framed by the ideology of nationalism, the principle of principle of nationality. Moreover, and this is based on an idea which developed in the late 18th, early 19th century in Europe, that the nation is a natural entity, a primordial entity. Although specific nations might go through periods of dormancy, might go through rises, falls, golden ages, whatever the case, the nation and someone's nationality is an essential part of who they are. In short, the nation is an ever-present actor in the dance macabre of the historical process. Now, of course, this idea of nations as a primordial entity that is relatively uncomplicated and to a certain extent is natural, has been thoroughly demolished by a series of scholars who have written broadly on nationalism in the last half a century, beginning with figures like Ernest Gellner, who I've already mentioned, as well as other prominent scholars, including Eric Hobsbawm and my old professor, John Bruley, whose book, Nationalism in the State, is recommended reading for anyone who is interested in nationalism. So that important point we need to raise is that, of course, when we're talking about nations and nationalism, we're not talking about natural political entities. And I just want to emphasize this because often in popular discourse and journalistic discourse, there's a kind of lazy thinking in which, national questions are reduced to a kind of easy binary, that there is a nation, it's oppressed, it's not oppressed, but it's relatively uncomplicated. I want to highlight here, of course, that it's complicated. Another important point I want to make about nationalism, and I think this is something we really need to think about, is that the proliferation of nation states, which from the nationalist perspective should solve the national question, has not solved the national question. The readjustment of international borders, the creation of new nation states, has not led to the end of nationalist political agitation in different parts of the world. And we need only look at, for example, the case of the Balkans. Balkan independence movements go back to the early 19th century. But, in recent years, the partition and the Balkanization of the Balkans, the creation of new nation states in the Balkans, did not solve any of the fundamental national issues. It just rearranged how those national issues were organized. So, we see this in the Bosnian Civil War, in the Greek Civil War, for example, in which Bulgarians were expelled from Greece. We see conflicts continuing in Bulgaria today between the Turkish-speaking minority and the Bulgarian population. So redrawing borders, creating new nation states, doesn't solve the national question. And that's an important thing which I think many of us, if we thought about it, would say, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, but it's something we don't usually highlight. So this is something else I want to highlight about this. And perhaps equally as important is that even in nation states which until recently we regarded as relatively secure, like Great Britain or Spain, where these states are now today facing unprecedented challenges from national minorities, nationalist movements in Scotland and Catalonia, and of course, I'm sure all of you have been following the news. So what do I draw from this? Well, the point I want to make here is that there's no resolution to national identity, and national identities and nationalist politics are always in this process of negotiation and renegotiation. And I don't believe that, or at least in the short term, I don't believe that we're ever going to come to some kind of final solution on dealing with the national question per se. However, the key problematic that I want to discuss today, the key issue I want to discuss today, is this question of whether Kurdish activism is necessarily linked with the question of statehood. To be a bit more precise, in short, can we look at Kurdish political activism in a way which understands its complexities and recognizes that not all manifestations of Kurdish political identity are nationalist in the strictest sense of the word. Not all manifestations of Kurdish political activism tend towards the creation of a nation state. And that is what I want to address today. So let me begin by starting with some of the contemporary events and how that fits into my way of looking at things, and kind of draw back and then provide some of the broader historical background. So let's start with the case of Iraqi Kurdistan. Now, in Iraqi Kurdistan kind of is an example which gravitates against my main thesis. As many of you may well know, on the 25th of September, Iraqi Kurdistan held a referendum on the question of independence. And anyone who knows anything about politics will know that you don't hold a referendum unless you intend to win it. And I think it was, I think nobody expected that Iraqi Kurds would vote against independence. Now, what is interesting about this referendum is the different ways in which it was interpreted inside Iraqi Kurdistan amongst the Kurdish community. So, of course, there was opposition to the referendum from various minority groups within Iraqi Kurdistan and also within the disputed territories which the Kurds until recently controlled, and which are home to large non-Kurdish minorities, including Turkmens, Arabs, Assyrians, Chaldeans, and so on and so forth. So I'm discussing here, what I'm talking about here is not the opposition that was coming from various minority groups who were within the sort of zone in which the referendum was held, but within the Kurdish community itself. So from the government perspective, from the perspective of Iraqi Kurdistan's dominant political party, the Kurdistan Democratic Party, led by Masoud Barzani, the Kurdish referendum was the end point of a long historical struggle. A struggle which could be dated back to the 1960s or dated back to the 1920s, or even dated back, according to some of the more fantastical interpretations, right back to the times of the ancient mythical Iranian king Zuhak, who was apparently, according to the Kurdish reading of things, was slain by Kawa, the blacksmith, who has been appropriated by Kurds as their kind of mythical national hero. And sort of the political aspect, the political side to this was that the Iraqi Kurds made the argument, whether correct or not, that they've tried to work with the Iraqis to come to some kind of arrangement in which they can live alongside each other, but it's simply not possible. And so that's the government side, that's the pro-referendum side, and that's probably what you might expect from the people holding a referendum on Kurdish independence. But what I found most interesting about the referendum was the opposition movement. And so there was a no campaign, which was supported by a minority of people in Iraqi Kurdistan. But what was striking about the no campaign was the no campaign did not reject independence. Their argument was not that, no, we shouldn't have independence. This is quite different, for example, from the Scottish referendum that was held. In Scotland, there was a genuine sense that there was genuine minority of the population, majority ultimately, because the referendum didn't pass, but there was a significant element of the Scottish population who looked positively on the relationship with Great Britain. There was a genuine kind of unionism existing in Scotland at the time. Now, how far that unionism will continue is a question. But there is no equivalent kind of Iraqi unionism amongst the Iraqi Kurds, even amongst the no voters. Their argument was not that we should not have independence. Their argument was that Kurdistan's president, well, now former president, Masoud Barzani, was illegitimate. He had signed the referendum into law by executive order. He ignored the parliament. So their problem was not independence per se, but, at least in their public statements, their problem was that things were not following due process. Things weren't working according to the law, which is a very interesting thing. So virtually everybody agreed in Iraqi Kurdistan that Kurdistan should be independent. The question was how, when, and on whose terms. So as I said, this kind of gravitates against the argument that I'm trying to make today, but I'm hopefully going to give some counterexamples which will perhaps make this picture a little bit less clear-cut. Now, I should note here, since the referendum, things have not gone so well for the Iraqi Kurds, and it looks like, Iraqi Kurdistan is not going to be able to obtain its independence, and its fate will be tied to the rest of the Iraqi population. However, the unity that will exist between Arabs and Kurds in Iraq, at least in the short term, and I don't believe this is sort of necessarily going to continue forever, but at least in the short term is going to be achieved through force. So, whether Kurds like it or not, they're going to have to be part of Iraq, and they're just going to have to enjoy that, and they're just going to have to make the best of that. So again, as I said, this lends support to the idea that nationalist political agitation, Kurdish activism, tends towards independence. But I want to, one of the interesting aspects of studying the Kurdish question is that unlike most national questions, we have a number of different laboratories in which we can compare Kurdish movements. There's a Kurdish movement in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, and of course in each of those countries there are different specific political conditions which have shaped those movements. So we have a number of different case studies which we can compare. All these groups, from Turkey to Iraq to Syria to Iran, they all claim adherence to the Kurdish identity. They all claim to be part of the same nation, at least on a level of discourse. But in practice, the way that politics works in each of these countries follows very different lines. So, the Kurdish movement in Turkey is very different from the Kurdish movement in Iraq. And the Kurdish movement in Iraq is, of course, different from the movement in Syria and different from the movement in Iran. So we have a number of different laboratories where we can see different types of Kurdish politics coming to the fore. And I think Turkey and Syria are interesting counterexamples to what has happened in Iraq. Now, I don't want to go into too much details as to why I think Kurdish political activism in Iraq has tended towards the creation of a nation state. And I'll be happy to answer any questions on that during the Q&A. Just to note that, yes, in Iraq, that's the tendency of politics, whereas in Syria and Turkey we have a very different trajectory of the Kurdish movement. So, in order to discuss Syria and Turkey, I need to discuss a little bit about the history of the leading Kurdish political force in both those countries, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, better known by its Kurdish acronym, the PKK. And more specifically, we need to talk a little bit about the ideology and political thought of the PKK's leader, Abdullah Öcalan. Now, I want to preface what I'm saying here, and I want to be very clear that I am not attempting to be an apologist for Abdullah Öcalan. I'm merely trying to highlight some of his important, I think the word might be contributions to the development of the Kurdish movement in both Syria and Turkey. So what is the PKK? Well, the PKK was a political party in Turkey founded in 1978. And its initial objective was the formation of a united, independent, and socialist Kurdistan. So, in many ways, the PKK has been the most maximalist and most radical Kurdish political organization in the modern era. It sought not only to win independence for the Kurds in one part of Kurdistan, i.e. its base in Turkey, but to create this pan-Kurdish state which brings together all Kurds. And of course, part of this program was not just bringing these areas together, but constructing a new political order based on socialism. And the PKK were very serious about this. Even before the PKK launched its insurrection against the Turkish government, which began in 1984, it was very active in the Kurdish regions of Turkey. And many of its early targets were more reformists, more moderate Kurdish political groups. For example, the PKK launched a series of attacks on a rival political party known as the the Socialist Party of Kurdistan. And the rationale behind the PKK's attacks on the Socialist Party of Kurdistan was that they didn't want independence. They just wanted autonomy, which made them sellouts, collaborationists, and traitors. Now, Abdullah Öcalan, who was eventually arrested by Turkish security forces in 1999, has written a little bit about, the climate in which the PKK was formed, and I think it's it gives an interesting insight into the ideologies that shape the PKK. He notes that when the PKK was formed in the 1970s, the international ideological and political climate was characterized by a bipolar world of the Cold War and conflict between the socialist and capitalist camps. The PKK in this context was inspired by the rise of decolonization movements all over the world. There seemed to be only one viable solution for the Kurdish question. That was the creation of a nation state, which was the paradigm of capitalist modernity at the time. So obviously we can see here a little bit of, you can see the influence of sort of Soviet Stalinism or Maoism and the way that Öcalan kind of frames the Kurdish question within this broader issue of decolonization. However, in more recent times, the PKK has changed its ideology, and particularly after Abdullah Öcalan was arrested in 1999. And while in prison in Turkey, he radically changed the approach of the he radically rethought his ideas regarding the Kurdish question, which had a profound effect on the development of the PKK. Anyone who is familiar with the PKK will be fully aware of the grotesque cult of personality that has been developed around Abdullah Öcalan, which has given him which in a way gives his political thought, which means his political thought has been deeply impactful on the movement. So we have to take his words, even if we don't take them seriously as a philosophical text or as a text of political thought, we need to take them seriously because they have a concrete impact on politics. And he noted that over the last decades, Kurds have not only struggled against the repression by the dominant powers and for recognition of their existence, but also for the liberation of their society from the grip of feudalism. Hence, it does not make sense to replace the old chains by new ones or even enhance the repression. What is the foundation of a nation state? What the foundation of a nation state would mean in the context of capitalist modernity? Without opposition to capitalist modernity, there will be no place for the liberation of peoples. This is why the founding of a Kurdish nation state is not an option for me. So after his imprisonment, he basically, while not rejecting the sort of Kurdish question outright, he rejects the idea that a nation state can solve the Kurdish question, which is a kind of interesting development, because usually in the story of nationalism, we sort of have this story where, well, you have moderate demands, and as time goes on, people become more and more nationalist, and it's kind of like a flow, and eventually, kind of explodes in nationalist political mobilization. And that's very much how the narrative in Iraqi Kurdistan is built. But in the case of the PKK in both Turkey and Syria, it's the reverse. They start from the most maximalist position and work their way back. And this working their way back is not simply framed in terms of pragmatism, i.e. we're not going to get a state because the international conditions don't fit. It's framed in a positive light, that we have an alternative to the nation state. And the alternative Abdullah Öcalan comes up with is this concept of democratic confederalism. Now, democratic confederalism is a kind of interesting piece of work. It is inspired by a very obscure source. There was, he died in 2006, a Bronx-born New England anarchist called Murray Bookchin, and somehow his books in Turkish translation arrived with Öcalan in the prison, and he began reading them alongside numerous other texts. And Bookchin's ideology is basically, Bookchin himself is an interesting fellow. He began as a communist before the Second World War, but after the Second World War split from communism and took up the anarchist cause and developed ideas that people should rule themselves, as you might expect, that there should be decentralized forms of government, there should be popular participation in decision making, and these ideas very much influenced Öcalan. And what we see is in May, after a brief kind of communication with Bookchin, although the two never, the two exchanged letters, although eventually Bookchin died before there could be further exchanges. Basically, Öcalan takes the philosophy of Bookchin and kind of builds his own ideology out of it. And in May 2005, Öcalan makes a statement through his lawyers about democratic confederalism, basically stating that the PKK is no longer interested in creating a Kurdish nation state. They're no longer even interested in creating sort of an autonomous region, a kind of quasi-nation state within Turkey or within Iraq and stuff like that. But they'd entirely rejected the model of the nation state. And that the Kurdish movement should focus its energy less on developing, trying to win a nation state, and more towards developing participatory forms of local government and dealing with social issues such as the issue of feudalism, landowning, and of course, as many of you might be aware, women's rights. This is, Öcalan once described the PKK as a woman's party, a party that was dedicated to female liberation, which I always find quite funny, because from most accounts, during his time in Syria, Öcalan was quite the misogynist with his own harem of Gaddafi-style, like female Amazon fighters and so on and so forth. But on a level of discourse, this is extremely important to understand. This becomes the emphasis of the PKK. And you know, if you follow the news, this has proved very attractive to many journalists in the West who get very excited when they see young Kurdish women taking up arms and fighting ISIS. It fits a nice little narrative for them. And it's kind of interesting because both political figures on the left and the right tend to lionize the female fighters of the PKK and its offshoot in Syria, the PYD, the Kurdistan the Union Party. Now, Öcalan's ideas of course, came to his supporters through his lawyers. So although he has exercised an important ideological influence on the PKK and pro-PKK organizations, he does not have the ability from his prison cell to direct the day-to-day operations of the Kurdish movement in Turkey or Syria. So it's been left up to actors on the ground to kind of interpret these vague kind of directives that we should respect women's rights, we should have decentralized government, and we should reject the nation state. And these have in Syria and Turkey had kind of different effects and have been looked at interpreted in different ways. So I'm going to look now at how Öcalan's ideas of democratic confederalism have been looked at in Syria and how they've been mobilized in Turkey. So let's move to Syria. Sometimes the Kurdish region, or the areas of Syria in which the Kurdish militias control, is called Rojava. Rojava is an interesting word. It literally means west. And the reason they call the region Rojava is because, well, Kurdish nationalists don't like to say Iraqi Kurdistan or Turkish Kurdistan, or they like to say North Kurdistan, South Kurdistan, East Kurdistan, West Kurdistan. It's their rebellion against the nation state in a level of discourse. But what is interesting in Rojava is that in certain ways the Kurdish movement there, which has been led by the Democratic Union Party, which is the PKK's offshoot in Syria, has done things which we might expect from a nationalist political organization. For example, there's been a process of de-Arabization of the education. So in Kurdish controlled regions, there's been a move away from education in Arabic towards education in Kurdish, and also quite interestingly, education in Turkish, which is the de facto language the PKK uses for communications on a day-to-day level. So that's the kind of thing we might expect from nationalists. However, what's really interesting is that the way that the Syrian Kurdish movement, the PYD, has constructed the territories which they've gained control. And here I might make a little contrast to Iraqi Kurdistan. In 1991, as many of you might be well aware, there was a Kurdish uprising. The uprising was crushed, and then international forces came in and basically opened up a space in Iraq in which the Kurds could take power. And once they took power, what did they do? Well, they couldn't declare independence, but they did the next best thing. They attempted to establish a Kurdish autonomous region, which was constructed very much on the model of a nation state. But that is not what the Syrian Kurds have done. Instead, the Syrian Kurds have created this political order which on the surface, and I note this very importantly, on the surface is built around local government, local participatory councils, and autonomous cantons. So they did not create, well, it's kind of interesting, they did not create a unified Kurdish region, but rather a set of autonomous regions. And I'll come back to this in a minute, because there's a kind of interesting contrast we can make with Iraqi Kurdistan. Moreover, they do not call their region Kurdistan. They don't even call it Rojava in official communications. And this was made clear in an interview from the former PYD leader, Salih Muslim. In an interview with a Dutch journalist, he notes, there is no autonomous Kurdish region. So there is no question of recognizing a Kurdish autonomous region. We are part of Syria, and we hope we might expand all over Syria. We want a decentralized Syria in which everybody has their rights. So this is kind of interesting because, you know, he's arguing, hey, this isn't a model for Kurds. We're not building a Kurdish nation state. We're building a political model that can be exported. Another interesting quotation I have is from Mazlum Kobani. Mazlum Kobani is the leader of the Syrian Democratic Forces. This is one of the military wings of the PYD, which includes both Arab and Kurdish fighters. And Mazlum Kobani is well known to the Americans because he's the main interlocutor between the American military and the Kurdish fighters in Syria. And in an interview given just after the liberation of Kobani, he makes this interesting statement. He says, Leader Apo is a philosophy and an ideology. The PKK is an organization and a political party. He makes this key distinction between the philosophy of Öcalan and the PKK as an institution. And then he goes on to note this, and this is what I find the most interesting. And there are Arabs who want to learn about Leader Apo's philosophy and who embrace it. There are thousands of them who were martyred alongside us. So there's a kind of almost missionary kind of impulse behind the PYD's ideology. It is not, or at least from their perspective, they do not regard it as an exclusively Kurdish ideology, but as a political model that they can export to the rest of Syria. Now, why was I saying surface? Why was I saying, you know, like this looks at this all on the surface? Well, because if we go a little bit below the official discourse of the PYD, if we go a little bit below the surface of the PYD, we see behind it, of course, there is this very powerful, very centralized political organization. So there's a kind of the interesting comparison I want to make with Iraqi Kurdistan is that in Iraqi Kurdistan, once Iraqi Kurdistan sort of gained its autonomy after 1991, there was a kind of official, the official picture was that there is a region called Iraqi Kurdistan, and we are united in Iraqi Kurdistan. The reality is there was there was in fact two states. There was one governed by Masoud Barzani and one governed by Jalal Talabani. So although on a level of discourse there was a kind of a pretense of unity, in practical terms that we were dealing with two separate administrations. The irony here is in Syria, there's a pretense that everything is decentralized, everything is, you know, like locally ruled. But behind it is this very powerful, very centralized political organization. The PKK historically has been one of the most centralized communist parties in the world. In the 1990s, it was one of only two communist parties that did not possess a Politburo, the other communist party being the North Korean Communist Party. So it's highly centralized, and that centralized Stalinist structure, which is based on the PKK and PYD's monopolization of Asayish forces, the kind of security forces in the region, you know, is behind, you know, lies behind the surface of all this. And perhaps the clearest expression of this is the continuation of the cult of Öcalan. One of the pictures, for example, after the Raqqa liberation, which some of you might have seen, was that once Raqqa was liberated, they put up a big picture of Öcalan, which of course freaked out the Turkish government because, like, what's going on here? Öcalan's terrorist. And actually there was a great tweet I saw today. I opted against using PowerPoint today because I know, like, everybody hates PowerPoint, and, you know, it just, you know, kills your talk. But I would have liked to show. And this picture was like a group of female fighters were painting this like mural of Öcalan in the square in Raqqa. So, you know, on level of official discourse, there's this adherence to kind of decentralization and so on and so forth. Behind it is this kind of like very hardcore, serious, vanguardist political party. But discourse matters, right? Discourse does matter. The way the PYD presents itself does matter. And it remains to be seen whether Öcalan's ideology will gain support amongst Arabs. It may not. It's a fascinating process to observe. And I have been following the news that, and it's very hard to determine whether this is real or fake, but there are more and more Arabs who seem to be interested in PKK ideology. Of course, this could all be some fake news operation launched by the PYD. It's very easy to do nowadays with the internet, but I would genuinely like, you know, if I had the opportunity, I'd love to go to Syria and actually find out what the heck's going on the ground. Because a lot of our information about Syria is very skewed. You have like one camp who just hates the PYD, that hates the PKK, and another camp which is just uncritical, especially amongst the anarchists in the United States, who seem to be unaware of the Stalinist history of the PYD. So I find this extremely interesting that we have in Syria a Kurdish movement which is explicitly non-nationalist, if we use the definition of nationalism I outlined at the beginning of the talk. And a similar kind of observation can be made about Turkey. Now, I don't want to talk too much about the PKK in Turkey. I'll make this note. After the success of the Syrian Kurds, particularly after the defense of Kobani, which was attacked by ISIS in 2014-2015, after the liberation of that, many PKK fighters crossed back into Turkey, and you have in 2015 the PKK attempting to basically do the same thing that was being done in Syria, but doing it in southeast Turkey. Now, of course, in retrospect, that was an absolutely ridiculous idea, because there's one thing setting up a new state formation basically in a power vacuum where the government's collapsed, and another thing, attempting to do that when you're facing NATO's second largest army. And the result of the PKK's attempt to export the Syrian experiment, re-import the Syrian experiment into Turkey, was the wholesale destruction of numerous towns in southeastern Turkey. Again, had I done a PowerPoint, I might have put some pictures of that, because it's really shocking to see that the level of destruction that has taken place in Turkish Kurdistan over the last couple of years. Many of the towns, such as Mardin, Diyarbakir, they're indistinguishable from the pictures you see of Aleppo or other cities in Syria. So that's an important kind of addendum I want to note about. But I really want to focus on the parliamentary movement that has developed in Turkey, the Kurdish parliamentary movement, the latest iteration of which is the HDP, the People's Democratic Party. Yeah, sorry, I just totally forgot the name of the party there for a second. That would have been terrible. So the People's Democratic Party is kind of interesting because it builds on a prehistory of Kurdish parliamentary political activism in Turkey. And what we see basically from the early 90s onwards is the emergence of sort of Kurdish interest parties in Turkey. And these, and of course these, in the kind of perverse way in which the Turkish legal system works, is that anti-racism and anti-discrimination laws are usually deployed against minorities rather than the majority. So these laws often meant that Kurdish political parties were banned in Turkey. So you have you have a kind of cycle which begins in the early 1990s, in which you have Kurds elected to the parliament, their political party is kind of disbanded, a bunch of them are chucked in jail, and then the whole story starts again. But what's interesting is that after the closure of the BDP, which was the precursor to the HDP, a new political party was formed, the HDP, under the co-leadership of Selahattin Demirtas and Figen Yüksekdağ. And this political party has made an extraordinary transformation in Turkish politics. Now currently, of course, anyone who's following the news will know that many of the leaders of the party, including the co-leaders, have now been arrested by Turkish authorities. They're facing trial, and things are not looking great for them. But the recent history of that political party, and if there's anyone interested in reading more about it, there is an excellent article in the New Left Review by Djene, which gives a really good summary of the HDP story. What is interesting about it is that this political party, of course, as you might expect, shares a base with the PKK. Many of its supporters are pro-PKK activists, former PKK activists. There are accusations even that some of its members in parliament were at some time PKK activists. But what it has done is taken the concept of democratic, the vagueness of the concept of democratic confederalism, to create a political party which has a broader appeal. They do not reject the Kurdish identity of the party, but rather they attempt to expand that, the party's base of appeal by making alliances with Turkish political organizations. Now, this hasn't been super successful, but they have won support from certain parts of the Turkish left, LGBT activists, and other groups which we might call oppressed groups in Turkey. So rather than trying to present itself as a Kurdish party, the Kurdish Interest Party. It's tried to present itself as a kind of counter-hegemonic party, a party which has an alternative vision, not just for the Kurds in Turkey, but for the whole of Turkey. One based around decentralized government, one based around the recognition of diversity in Turkey, one which has a economically and socially progressive political message. This was, for example, summed up in a speech by Selahattin Demirtas, who made the point in speaking to a crowd to his supporters that you are not only Turkish or Kurdish. He said, you are not solely Armenian, Arab, Circassian, Georgian, Bosniak. You are all of them. You are not only Alevi, Sunni, Syriac, or Yazidi. You are not solely Jewish, Hebrew, or Christian. You are all. So the idea that the Kurds should show solidarity with other oppressed groups in the country, and they should, of course, in turn, show solidarity back. The point was expanded on by the HDP's deputy chairwoman, Hatice Altınsık, who basically summed up the party's approach saying to pluralism as this: please remember, even if we are perceived as a pro-Kurdish party, we are also a pro-woman party, a pro-Alawi party, a pro-Christian party, a pro-Muslim party, a pro-peace party. When you listen to Demirtas, I believe you will hear he's in support of the working class, the oppressed. So being a Kurd is just one of the identities. Our aim is to unite the left in Turkey. So what we've seen in the form of the HDP is a very interesting evolution of the Kurdish movement. We might expect in political conditions where we're seeing greater and greater authoritarianism from the Turkish government that Kurds might radicalize, become more nationalist. But here we've seen in a different kind of transformation where a party or a political tradition that had once been somewhat, which had been limited to sort of the Kurdish community in Turkey, has sought to expand its base of support. And the HDP, although it has an organic link with the Kurdish movement that comes out of a Kurdish political tradition, might equally be understood as part of a broader movement in Europe, in which we're seeing the rise of sort of more left-wing political parties, such as Syriza in Greece, or Jeremy Corbyn's Labour, or the Green Party maybe in the United States. So we're seeing the HDP taking a very different sort of political track towards, from, for example, the Kurdish political parties in Iraq. So how am I doing for time? Very little. Well, unfortunately, I'm not going to get to talking too much about the sort of the antecedents in the Ottoman period. So I apologize for that, because it seems that I have mistimed my talk and I'm droning on a little bit too much about contemporary events. But I do want to kind of finish on some important points. When we look at these developments, many people see sort of the ideology of the PKK and PYD, the ideology of the HDP, as something new, something post-national, something exciting, which is certainly true in some extent. However, at the same time, we need to put this political activism in the broader history of the Kurdish movement. And what I mean by this is that Kurdish, my point is not that these modern movements draw directly on, for example, the intellectual thoughts of Ottoman Kurdish intellectuals in the early 20th century, but rather the ideas rather basically the idea that the rejection of the nation state as a solution to the national question is not new in Kurdish history. There is in fact a long tradition of accommodationist Kurdish political activism in the Middle East. And I don't mean, this is not simply because Kurdish political actors felt that a nation state was desirable but unattainable, but a genuine commitment to some kind of multinational, multicultural, pluralistic political order. Basically the idea that Kurdish national rights, Kurdish national self-determination can be achieved, can be won beyond the nation state. There's no need for the creation of a separate Kurdish nation state. Now this concept of accommodationism, I haven't invented it myself. I'm not such an original thinker, comes from the work of Elin Komiso, who has worked extensively on nationalist activism in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And her point is that, she makes this really important point, is that although in the 19th and 20th century we see growing national consciousness in a general sense of the word, just because people came to see themselves as Czech, German, Polish, or what have you, does not mean that they automatically saw their fate and their future within a separate nation state. There are a number of different forms of political activism which we might call nationality politics that do not tend towards the creation of a separate nation state. And that's something we need to take seriously, and it's something we need to understand. And I'll tell you why I think this is so important. I'll conclude on this point. The reason I think this is important is that often when we study the history of national questions, we focus on conflict, right? And that's a very understandable tendency. You know, violence is, well, I wouldn't use the word exciting, but is something that, you know, we pay attention to. And so, you know, the most maximalist, the most radical nationalists are often the people that we follow. And we tend not to look at the more moderate individuals who seek kind of accommodations without taking the more maximalist demands. And I think that's something we need to take seriously. On one hand, it allows us to avoid a kind of lazy teleology relating to nationalism, i.e. that, you know, you have the story of nationalism is a story of awakening. You know, people gradually become conscious of their nationhood, and then their true interests lie in the creation of a nation state. So we avoid that kind of teleology, which is very much how Kurdish history has been written in the last 50 years. But at the same time, I think there's a perhaps more interesting point here, and it is that if we kind of reject the idea that for example, that Kurdish political activism is the same as Kurdish nationalism in every single case, we can develop more interesting research questions. Rather than asking the kind of sterile questions of why Kurdish nationalism has failed, or, you know, why don't the Kurds have a state, we can ask more interesting questions. Specifically, how and why have Kurds at different moments in history mobilized their identity in specific ways? And in that way we can get a more fuller understanding of the broad range of Kurdish political activism that has taken place. And we can avoid some of the kind of pitfalls of methodological nationalism, and perhaps on a policy level, we can kind of counter the kind of stereotypes that exist among state elites that any form of national agitation or nationality-based activism is going to inevitably lead to conflict, war, and division. Thank you very much for your time. Please.
Very interesting talk. Particularly interested in the shift away from a kind of statist nationalism toward a pluralist idea. But I want to give you a chance to maybe talk a little bit about the prehistory that you kind of wanted to get into. And I wanted to ask about the statist variant, and particularly the kind of materialist attributes of statist nationalism that may or may not be there, and ask you to comment on whether they were there or whether they are absent, and maybe about what the absence means. So were there ever Kurdish coins, stamps, newspapers printed in Kurdish, maps of Kurdistan with place names in Kurdish, flags, a constitution? Did they ever attempt to kind of assemble the material surroundings of a state?
Oh, definitely. We've had various experimentations in this. For example, just before the Iraq War, for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan, some guy, I don't know who it was, began printing like something called the Kurdo, which was like supposed to be the Kurdish currency should Kurdistan become independent. And of course, various, like for example, in Iraqi Kurdistan in the 1990s, they printed their own stamps. And, you know, yes, the paraphernalia of nationalism is something that Kurds have been very, you have, for example, maps of Greater Kurdistan. There's a guy who claims he was at Harvard. He might have been at Harvard, I don't know. Called Mirdad Izadi, who is well known for creating kind of like fantasy Kurdish maps in which like he creates provincial divisions in Kurdistan that have never existed, and like, you know, all this kind of stuff. And we see, of course, Kurdish movements developing this kind of paraphernalia of independence, especially after the end of the First World War, after the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. For example, in the Mahabad Republic, which was a brief experiment of Kurdish sort of autonomy in Iran after the Second World War, you know, they have a flag, they have like I mean, Iraqi Kurdistan has a flag, you know, they have a national anthem that nobody knows the words to half the time. But you know, you have all the, you have that paraphernalia. Of course, because there's no Kurdish nation state, that paraphernalia is quite diverse. For example, I know we were talking just before the talk with Dr. Istrabadi, and we're talking about the Kurdish flag. And the Kurdish flag you see today, which is this like, you know, Italian flag on its side with the sun in the middle, that was not actually the original Kurdish flag. The first flag to be created as the Kurdish flag was created in 1919 in Suleymaniye during the course of a sort of Kurdish nationalist uprising against the British. And that flag is totally different from this flag, which was invented in the 1930s by a group of Kurdish intellectuals who were living in Syria at the time. So yes, they have that paraphernalia, but because of the lack of the nation state, there's a lot of diversity in that paraphernalia. Please.
Could you talk a little bit more about the relationship between religion and nationalism among Kurdish groups? I mean, I'm thinking more specifically in Iranian Kurdistan. I mean, I've heard, I haven't really looked at the issue enough that secessionism is mostly supported by the Sunni Kurdish population, but not the Shiite Kurdish population, who tend to favor unity with Iran.
Yeah. Well, in terms of Iran, I don't want to speak too much about the Iranian Kurdish situation because I'm not an expert on it, and also finding information, accurate information, is quite difficult. I would note, and I mean, like, there is a religious element to it. Since Iran became a Shia state, Sunnis have been discriminated against, and of course, nationalist sentiment, as you might expect, is stronger amongst Kurdish Sunnis than it is amongst Kurdish Shias. But I'd like to make a little bit of a meta point about the relationship between the Kurdish identity and Islam. A lot of the recent literature, especially the literature looking, for example, at Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, has often come up with this kind of lazy argument that, well, Islam diffuses the national question. Like, Islam provided an umbrella for, you know, Kurds and Turks to live together. And that, in certain contexts, is true. In certain contexts, the discourse of religion has been used to kind of say, hey, we're all brothers, let's work together, you know, like let's put our Islamic identity first. And that has adherence amongst Kurdish activists. But that's too simple a story, because at times religion and the specificities of the Kurdish practice of Islam have been mobilized as a point of difference between Kurds and other communities. Now, this is apparent in Iran, where you have this very clear-cut divide between Sunni and Shia. Well, clear-cut, you have a divide between Sunni and Shia. But this is also true in Turkey. You know, what's the phrase people have? The narcissism of small differences. So you have in Turkey, Kurds tend to follow the Shafi'ite rite of Islam, and Turks tend to follow the Hanafite rite of Islam. And in certain historical eras, this has been made a big deal of, saying, hey, like for example, in the 19th century, many of the most radical nationalists, those one pushing for a Kurdish nation state, were also from the most religious sections of society, which is kind of counterintuitive. But their arguments at the time were like, hey, the Turks are a bunch of kafirs, they've abandoned Islam, they've subjected themselves to Western-style laws, and we're better Muslims, and we shouldn't have to follow these guys. So Islam, you know, sometimes Islam has been used as a kind of bonding agent, but at times it's been mobilized as a point of difference. And you know, one of the key aspects of my work, which I haven't talked about today, is kind of questioning that relationship. And I take my lead in that point from a very excellent scholar of Islam and Kurdish history, Dr. Kemal Soleimani, who's a lecturer in New York and who's written extensively on the very complicated relationship between nationalism and and religious identity, not only in the Kurdish case, but also in a broader context. And what his work has done, and what my work has done to a lesser extent, is kind of trying to break that lazy link that, hey, Islam diffuses nationalism, inevitably. That is not the case. We have to look at it case by case. We have to look at the specific situation. It is very easy for people to create, seemingly impenetrable boundaries between each other over what we might, from outside, look at relatively minor differences. I mean, like, I didn't know what the difference between a Croat and a Serb was. They speak a similar language. You even have. I met a student once who described herself as an Orthodox Croatian, which is kind of a weird idea, something that you don't usually come across every day. But the point comes down to this: is what symbolic resources are used to create boundaries between people depends on the political context. And Islam, as well as breaking down those boundaries in certain contexts and providing a kind of common symbolic resource to unite people, can also be mobilized in the kind of reverse to kind of create differences between each other. That is obvious in Iran today, but that's a kind of a perennial feature of Kurdish activism throughout the modern era. Please.
So the move by the HDP to be a more class-based and inclusive kind of party that's joining up with forces on the left, to me, I see that as a continuity with the PKK ideology, which has always been anti-feudal and the attacks on the big land owners and things like that. So there's a continuity with that. I wonder if it really washes out the whole idea of shared Kurdish identity in favor of a more class-based identity, and I wonder how successful such a politics could possibly be in Turkey.
I mean, I'm a kind of pessimist. I guess if you lived in the Middle East, you end up as a kind of political pessimist. So, I mean, like on a normative level, on a personal level, yes, I am personally attracted to the politics of the HDP, that idea of building a more class-based politics and so on and so forth. But my personal predilections have nothing to do with whether a political movement will be successful or not. But I think there is an important point that needs to be made here about kind of expanding what we mean by the Kurdish question, in the sense that the anti-feudal aspect, the idea of education, development as being important, those are also important parts of the Kurdish question. And groups like the PYD and also the HDP in Turkey, they're not rejecting the Kurdish question, saying there's no Kurdish question, let's talk just about class. But they're framing it within a broader context, right? They're trying to say that, hey, statehood is not what we're emphasizing. That's not going to solve the Kurdish question. Let's focus on issues such as getting rid of feudalism, right? Let's focus on developing our society. And what's kind of interesting about this, and I didn't get to it in my talk, is that there's an interesting through line with the kind of discourse that was being expressed by Kurdish activists in the late Ottoman period. There were nationalists in the late Ottoman period. Nationalist and accommodationist political tendencies developed alongside each other in the late Ottoman period. It's not an easy story from accommodationism to nationalism. These tendencies win favor by different groups for different reasons. And the accommodationist faction in the late Ottoman period, when they talk about the Kurdish question, it's primarily understood as a social question, i.e. our society is backwards, we need to learn to be educated, we need to develop ourselves. I think there's a parallel, for example, that could be drawn between that kind of ideology and, for example, the Polish movement at that moment, the organicists movements who focused on developing the community rather than fighting for a nation state, which they thought, well, that's not really going to help anything at the same time. And the other fruit point is that although like the HDP, the PYD, come at these questions from a very different ideological background from the Kurdish activists in the late Ottoman period, it's interesting that they're focusing on similar things, i.e. education, social development, and economic reform and things like that, and prioritizing those over the quest for a nation state. This is like in Iraqi Kurdistan, a couple of days before the referendum, we had a chap come down to Missouri from the KRG representation in Washington, D.C. And I was asking, I was like, so, you know, Kurdish society has a lot of problems. Well, what do you think independence is going to achieve? And he was like, well, we first have to get our state first, and then we can deal with all the problems. So, you know, like there's a very different prioritization in terms of what's the main issue for Kurds to deal with. And I think on the balance of things, focusing on like concrete, you know, I remember one of my students in Iraq, Kurdistan, got into big trouble. There was some guy from America, one of these think tank people, you know, the kind of ones who aren't very bright, but, you know, like, but they like to go on like fact-finding trips, and, you know, they learn a couple of words of Arabic, and I'm not going to say who it is, by the way. But, you know, this guy was super embarrassing. Like, he'd apparently been going to Kurdistan for like 20 years, and he still couldn't say bougie, which is like, he pronounced everything wrong, and he kind of laughed at me when I said, do you think, you know, I don't think Hillary Clinton's going to win the election. And he laughed at me. I was like, well, I'm right, you're wrong now. But anyway, this guy comes along, and he talks. He's more nationalist than the Kurds, giving a big talk saying that Kurds need to fight for independence and democracy, blah blah blah. And you know, and one of my students, who I know that student sympathizes with nationalism, but she asked the smart question. She was like, what will independence achieve for us, like in a practical sense? How's it going to be different from today? And he didn't have an answer. And nobody had an answer to it, because it's like, well, you know, there are other issues that we have to, there are other priorities for people. Now, we can understand in certain political contexts why people might prioritize the winning of a nation state. But, you know, it's a very complicated process, and we have to kind of conceptualize the Kurdish question as something broader than just the quest for statehood. It's the quest for the advancement of a nation. And even if we regard the nation as a kind of artificial construct and so on and so forth, we should recognize that, yeah, it's a reality. People are kind of attached to that idea. And also at the same time, we need to recognize that there are multiple ways in which national rights can be advanced. And that's an important thing that we often lose sight of, because, you know, most people don't have time to read extensively about, like, most people don't have the time to sit down and read, like, Kurdish newspapers from the 1910s, or, like, I don't know, one of my friends read, like, I think, like, 10,000, you know, I think it said something like 1,000 pages of minutes taken from some obscure Kurdish leftist organization that existed in the 1960s. They don't have time to go into the nuances. So humans are lazy thinkers. And, you know, setting it as this kind of binary, Kurds want a state, the people who rule over Kurds don't want them to have a state, it sells. It's easy to understand, when in fact it's often a lot more complicated than that.
I want to push back a bit on what you said about Iraq. I have no doubt that the majority, perhaps an overwhelming majority of Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan do want